Yeah, so I thought I'd just talk about a bit of my experience using AWS, Amplify, and Cognito tonight. The Amplify is a pretty massive library, so it's going to be difficult to cover everything. I'll cover some bits, maybe give you some pointers with what you can look into outside of this. Bit about me. So I guess I grew up in the greatest city on earth, as you can see, Birmingham. Yeah, my parents actually still live in Bourneville, would you believe, just down the road from the chocolate factory. And I did a history degree. And then at the end of that, I kind of realized, I wanted to get into computer science for some reason. So I did that for a year at Birmingham. And I guess the last sort of 12, 13 years, I guess I spent the first half doing Java for my sins with a bit of jQuery. And then I guess when I was at First Utility, I kind of, as their shell now, I started writing services in Node and doing React when it first came out. And then I recently left Wealth Wizards and I'm working for Igloo down south and trying to help them build the team and move them to kind of, well, we're using Vue or Nuxt on the front end and using a lot of Node and stuff and AWS stuff. So I mean, I guess common approaches to web apps that I see in the years that I've gone by, in JavaScript is that, people are building them with Express, maybe a bit of Lambdas, API gateway, or they're kind of getting really into it and building stuff with Docker. I spent 3 or 4 years building stuff with Kubernetes, and yeah, I think I'm still just about coming off the medication now that I had to be on when I was doing that. But I mean, these are the common approaches that I see, and I guess in some ways it feels like you're rolling your own a lot of the time. It's pretty complex, and there are easier ways of doing it. And in the same way, when you're doing auth, pretty much every place that I've been to have their own auth system. And they take on that responsibility, that overhead of managing auth. It's using PHP sessions, and that's kind of, I would say, a big stumbling block often to growing, because as you grow, you want to adopt a more secure, maybe more adaptive, flexible auth system that allows you to do different things. And when you're rolling your own, it's kind of it's not the best idea. So these are the kind of things that I see most kind of places I've been to. That's the challenges. So how can you do it better? I guess I done a lot of stuff in the last 4 years of AWS, and to be honest with you, it is good, but it can often feel like this monstrosity that I'm sure some of you have driven through, how do you get through Spaghetti Junction is pretty tough, isn't it? But I mean, that's often how it feels with AWS. And so you often end up with an architecture a little bit like this, when all you want to do is maybe allow users to log in. You want to render some HTML and some CSS or something, and maybe you want to, I don't know, talk to a database. This is the kind of things that I've worked on, this kind of architecture, and it gets really complicated really quick. And you kind of got to glue all this stuff together. So the backdrop to this obviously is that all I want to do typically, is I just want to render some HTML and JS. That's all I want to do, and maybe I want to have a service I want to authenticate and so on. So it can be very complicated with AWS. So one of the things that I try and encourage some of the engineers I work with is that, when we're building stuff, we're here to build business value. It's not just about using the latest tech and gluing it together in the most kind of elegant way. Trying to keep it simple and work on the business value. So there is a better way, and some of you have probably come across, I imagine, some of these kind of platforms for building apps. I've used all 3, and they're all really good. Talk a little bit about Amplify and why it's really easy to use, and it will simplify a lot of what you do when it comes down to deployment, CI/CD, all these kind of things. So if you go to AWS and you start off in the Amplify console, you can connect up to existing repo that you might have, and you can create an Amplify config file. And this is very similar to like a Netlify TOML file, or stuff that you've used, maybe Bitbucket pipelines, this sort of thing. And you can define some environment variables, and you can install your packages, and then you can build your app. And as long as that build step creates a dist folder with all your static website in, all you got to do is you say that my app's going to be in the dist folder, and Amplify just takes care of deploying your app for you. So there's no, I don't know, there's no kind of pushing to a EC2 instance or pushing to an S3 bucket or anything like that. It's all handled for you. And if you were doing all this yourself, you would, in the most efficient way in Amazon that I've done, hand cranking it, is that you typically would deploy to an S3 bucket. You'd serve that from a CloudFront distribution. And if you want to do anything funky, you might actually deploy a Lambda at edge. And all that stuff is going on behind the scenes with Amplify, but they're hiding it from you, and you don't have to worry about that and build your own CI/CD kind of framework. So if you want to keep your existing pipelines, let's say in Bitbucket or in GitHub, you can configure a webhook that will trigger this process to run once you've run all your tests. So for example, if you've got like a pipeline and you're running some tests and stuff, if you're happy that's all happened, you can then trigger the deployment to happen just via a webhook. So that's really nice. So you've got all your kind of deployment decoupled from your building of your software. And the nice thing is that you get all these other features. So you get the ability to just bake in some rewrites and redirects in your app if you've got some legacy stuff, which is really nice. You can define, I don't know if any of you have come across the Amazon CDK, but the Amazon CDK is like a really nice infrastructure as code tool where you can describe all your applications, whether they're Lambda functions or whether they're Node.js services or whatever, or databases, everything. You can describe it in code, not in like a YAML file. And you can also describe your Amplify build steps in code. So if you want to actually, it's just really nice because you're not manually setting jobs up. You can just template them. So that's a really nice tool if you're into your kind of DevOps infrastructure as code, something that I use. So yeah, so we've let's say we've built our app in Bitbucket. We've run a load of tests. We've hit the webhook. Amplify then goes through its steps. It builds the app and it deploys it. And the really nice thing, it just sets up it deploys the app to a particular domain, and then by default it will you can configure it so that it will listen to feature branches, and then it will deploy your app automatically as well. So you can have feature branch deployments. You're not going to build that yourself. That's out of the box of Amplify. So it's a really nice static website kind of workflow there. So I mean, that's kind of highlights, I guess, a lot about what it offers you in terms of your deploying your website. But I mean, obviously, as you know, there's a lot more to a web app. So one of the things that it comes with as well is a CLI, which is very useful, but also a series of NPM components that you can install. And one of the things that I've got here that I used in my last place was the way in which it can wrap your application inside your application. It can you can set it up to talk to Cognito. So when you start your application, whether it's a React application in this case, you can configure the Amplify library to work with a particular Cognito user pool. And a user pool is basically like a place where users live and you authenticate against. So the nice thing here is that behind the scenes, Amplify will wrap Axios, and then if you use the Amplify HTTP kind of library to make your calls to your server, it will handle all the refreshing of the JWT token and the storage of that. So you've not got to manage that in your React application, which is also really nice. So it works well with Cognito. Also, there's a really nice CLI GraphQL integration. So you can set up a like a GraphQL schema, and behind the scenes, what it will do automatically is it will create the backend for you as well. So if you imagine going back to my previous slide when I was showing that kind of like architecture diagram, if you imagine if you're doing this bit by bit, maybe using AppSync as a really cool tool if you want to get into that, then what you typically have to do is you would you'd set up your GraphQL model, and you'd have to create these what are called velocity templates to get the data out of whatever database. You'd have to set up where the data lives. Well, Amplify sets that all up for you. So when you create a model, it will create you a table in a database of your choice using the CLI, and then it will automatically create you these velocity templates so that you can then go and fetch the data from the table that it's created for you. So immediately you can start to see how you can you can deploy your front ends really nicely. You can fit with your authentication, and you can also build. You don't even have to have a server, because you can just talk to the stuff that it creates in the AWS resources. So what's kind of cool for us and really good, I think, is that, once you create these mutations in GraphQL, you can then annotate them, and you can say which roles are eligible to use those particular mutations. So that's really nice, because again, you're not kind of like trying to hand crank your role-based authentication. You can assign roles to users in Cognito, and then you can lock down operations that you're trying to give to people just with these little annotations, which is really nice. So there's that integration there with Cognito, which is great, and it's really easy to set up role-based authentication. Another thing that I guess is great, isn't it, that real-time updates when you're building your front end. Again, you can listen out to mutations that are happening just with these annotations, and then your front end using Amplify can listen out for those things that are happening on your server, and obviously respond and do some cool things. And in my last job, we were sort of putting this into practice for when we had financial advisors who were working on cases themselves, maybe both editing the case at the same time. They could get notifications that something's changed. If you think about a little bit of what you get in kind of Confluence when people are editing the same page, those kind of real-time updates are really easy and nice to do with GraphQL. So I guess in summary, Amplify works really well with Cognito. And my point earlier is that, when you're doing auth, I think, especially if you work in a big company, you don't really want to be handling it yourself and building your own stuff. So if you can offload that, that's kind of an important key thing. And I don't know about you, I've written a lot of this code using JSON Web Token, and we've all done it. And it feels good at the time, but actually you've got that sort of ball and chain around your neck for the rest of your life. So Cognito fits in with all these providers, the standard social media stuff, also SAML, and that's good if you're trying to sort of single sign on with Azure AD or whatever it is. And it has this concept of user pools and federated identities, which you can migrate into. So I just want to go through a little bit about the kind of setup in Cognito. So you have standard console where your users live. You can go through a series of screens where you can set the security levels, you can set what attributes the user is going to have, and the kind of password strength. Again, this is good because it enforces those sort of enterprise password strength things that you kind of need as you grow. And what's kind of cool as well is that, this is all obviously the kind of manual setup, but it also allows you to define Lambda triggers for execution as you go through various life cycles. So I guess if any of you guys wanted to move to Cognito, you're probably already going to have your own database of users. So how do you migrate things over? And what's really nice is that there are sort of stages in the process where you can write Lambda functions that will hook in and will maybe migrate data across. They might force users to reset their password. This is just one that we wrote previously, which is where when someone was being migrated, we wanted to look up the user and we wanted to push in some extra attributes into the token that was being issued. And in a similar way, we were able to use the Cognito API to force them to reset their password as well when they were migrated into the user pool. So there's all these kind of like Lambda triggers that you can put in place to help you move your users across and do some cool stuff, which I'll get onto in a little bit. I mentioned a bit about SAML and how it supports that. This is really incredibly useful when it comes down to kind of single sign-on with Active Directory. We put a Lambda function in there so that we were able to, when someone authenticated with their Microsoft AD account, we were able to map the groups, the AD groups they belong to, into groups or roles that they had in the Cognito user pool. Now, what this meant was that when the JWT was issued by Cognito, inside the JWT were a series of roles that matched the roles they had in Active Directory. And that meant that we could annotate our GraphQL mutations with those annotations that I showed before, saying only users who belong to this group could do that particular function. So it had a really nice way of doing that as well. And if any of you like kind of magic link support, there's this really nice article that you can read a little bit about that. By defining custom Lambda functions in your Cognito workflow, you can, instead of authenticating, as well as authenticating that they exist, their email exists, for example, you can then send them, hook into the process to send them an email with a link in it, which when they click on it can verify that they actually that they've clicked the link and so on. So you can build in a nice magic link support, which is really useful as well with Cognito, rather than building it yourself. I think what's also quite cool is that we were able to set up Cognito for loads of different kind of tenants, and in infrastructure as code. Again, we use Terraform, my last place. There's also, you can do it in the Amazon CDK or in similar libraries like Pulumi and so on. But you can set up Cognito pools and the integration with SAML as well, just in nice Cognito integration, really nice standard stuff. And what's cool is if you don't choose to use GraphQL and GraphQL's mutations and those annotations that I talked about, when you're defining Lambda functions, you can authenticate, you can put authentication in just by declaring that this endpoint should be tied to a Cognito user pool. So in other words, when you try and hit that endpoint with a JWT, it will check the validity of that JWT against the Cognito user pool. So just, you can quite see is that just with with pretty much no code, you can authenticate your applications and your endpoints, your APIs. So you've not got to write it, you're not going to touch your code. It's just purely annotation based or YAML config based if you're just doing HTTP REST. So I mentioned a little bit about some of the sort of Cognito group annotations that you can do. But I mean, yeah, I mean, I think the kind of highlight for me is that I think, a lot of what we do, in setting up development has become really easy, setting up an app or whatever. But if you're looking to kind of have a real slick deployment process and build process for your apps, then I think the danger is to try and sort of hand roll your own stuff, whether it would be with Docker or whatever, and end up with kind of a big building DevOps processes out to try and deploy your applications. And I think the really nice thing about things like Amplify and Netlify and that sort of stuff is they really simplify that a hell of a lot. And the Cognito as well takes a lot of the overhead when it comes down to authentication away from you. So you can just focus on the business logic and delivering customer value. So yeah, that's kind of just an overview really of that. So I hope that was helpful.
That was great. Thank you very much, Louis. Really appreciate that. I think we've got time for some questions if you're open to doing any questions.
Yeah, sure.
Fire away, people.
Yeah, I've got one. Sorry, I've got a question. Put my hand up. There was a word. Well, it's all right on the screen. It says hide complexity, and I'm just going to unpack my own fears about integrating with large frameworks. But there is something kind of that makes me a bit uncomfortable about committing such a critical piece to basically what, which is like, well, AWS have written this, they'll handle that. We'll just configure the tool. You know, what's the way you're pitching it makes it sound almost as if there would be no point in involving yourself in that complexity ever. Like, can you help assuage my fears of being completely abstracted away from the nuts and bolts of my own programs?
Yeah, sure. I think it's sort of the big thing is that if you're working in a big engineering team, then you've potentially got lots of points of failure, I suppose, if you're building a microservice architecture. So it might be nice to know everything about your application, but as you grow, that becomes kind of really difficult for everyone to have that knowledge, and maybe knowing about authentication or deployment. Maybe that's not what, I guess my argument would be that maybe it's not what your company's paying you for. They may be paying you to be really good at, financial advice or energy or whatever it is that you do. And I mean, okay, if you work for Auth0 or AWS Cognito or whatever, then great. But I suppose, these things can be time consuming, and I think if deployment's not done well, then you can be spending like hours every week doing deployment. And that becomes really bad. Like, we've got a situation now where I'm at where we're trying to, move to a more seamless deployment, really. And the current process, it's not manual, but it's just absorbs a lot of time. And every time a new pipeline set up, it's not really very slick. And yeah, I think you just cost you a lot of time. And when you get 100 engineers in a team working on stuff, if you're spending a lot of time with 10 engineers, then that's just only going to compound itself. So
yeah, I think I'm latching onto a point of scale where the problems might transform from one set of concerns into another. So yeah, I think that answers my question. Thanks.
No worries.
Adam, did you have a question?
Yeah, I wasn't sure whether the hand raising was a real thing or whether Jerome was just joking, so I kind of went with it, and then I was just no, that was amazing. Thank you very much. I have a question. So I've got an auth challenge of my own, as I'm sure lots of people have. I'm going to be doing some kind of Azure AD B2B integration. The company I work for is heavily kind of invested in Azure and Microsoft. Would you consider using these tools in that situation, or do you feel these tools are very much AWS centric and probably best if you're basing your entire infrastructure in AWS?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I mean, I think I probably, I wouldn't use Cognito, for example, if I was using Azure primarily. But I think the principle behind Amplify is a really great one. So, and I think, to be honest, for us, we really heavily considered using Netlify, which is obviously kind of quite agnostic. But it was more expensive for us than using Amplify. We were already kind of in bed with AWS, if you like. And so it was just kind of, but I think that kind of concept of, we've kind of trying to adopt for our front ends kind of mono repo at the moment. And one of the things that's been a stumbling block previously when I first joined was that for all the front end applications, they were essentially building a Docker image and deploying that to Fargate, and all it was doing was rendering HTML and CSS, right? And that process of creating a Docker image and deploying that was quite time consuming. So if you imagine if you create a monorepo and you've got like 4 front end applications in there, that whole deployment process is too slow. So the nice thing about Amplify and Netlify is they decouple the deployment from the build and test phase. So you build and you test your software, and then you just call out to them and say, right, you go and pull down the code now and go and deploy it for me, like decoupling that process. And so I think like if I was in Azure context, I think, using pretty much, I think Amplify is almost like a play on the word Netlify, isn't it? In a way, it's just like, so yeah, and I think I definitely use that for sure. And, I touched a little bit, although I didn't focus heavily on it. Some of the slides were showing the setup of functions with the serverless framework, and that works with Azure as well, I believe.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think if that's everyone, I think we'll say a final thank you then to Louis and James. And yeah, big thank you to everyone as well who's come. It's